y'all, welcome back. My name is Christina, and in this video we're going to be looking through Tracy Hogg's The Baby Whisperer Solves All Your Problems book. We'll be looking at chapter 3, which is your baby's liquid diet. Essentially it covers the first 6 months and a little bit into weaning and starting solids and beyond that. Just as a quick disclaimer, I don't have any affiliation with Tracy Hogg, with The Baby Whisperer, or with this book. I'm just a mom who's absolutely loved it, who's taken every principle in the book and applied it to my own life, and I just want to share my experience and my thoughts and my knowledge with everyone else. So essentially we're looking at your baby's liquid diet, which is the E in easy. So the easy routine is the Baby Whisperer's eat, activity, sleep, and you time routine. If you don't know about it, I do have another video that covers the basics. I really recommend getting your baby on this routine as soon as possible. You can start from birth, you can start when your baby's 2. It really helps. And it gives you a lot of sanity and a lot of insight and knowledge into your baby and who they are and their needs and how you can help fill those. So just to start off, I just want to say that I might be talking mostly about breastfeeding in this video, but whatever way you are feeding your baby, a fed baby is best. So whether it's formula, whether you're just pumping and exclusively bottle feeding, or if you are directly breastfeeding, anyway, this should apply to your baby and their liquid diet, to how much they should be consuming and how frequently they should be consuming. And as a reminder, if you're not familiar with this book, it was written in 2004, which is sadly the year that Tracy Hogg also passed away. I think that she does have a lot of outdated principles when it comes to breastfeeding. I think just knowledge about breastfeeding has really advanced in the last 19 years. And she wrote this book in the time that breastfeeding started to become a cool fad again. It was kind of after the hype of formula wore off and people started to realize that breast milk was technically better for their baby than formula was. And she tends to talk with a lot of moms who still do formula and who still were bottle feeding. So she does have a lot of good breastfeeding tips, but just keep in mind they might not be totally in line with the times that we live in today, and I think that's fine. I don't think she's necessarily wrong about anything, but we will be taking a look at some things I think she's right about. So the biggest concern in the first few months, honestly the first 6 weeks, is how much is enough? Is my baby eating enough? Are they eating too much? Are they eating too little? And how can I tell? In those first 6 weeks, having your baby on a structured routine is going to help you understand if your baby is eating too much or not enough. The goal is to not necessarily force them into a box, but to learn about who they are and what they need, and to provide them with that on a reliable basis. So a lot of people might hear the word routine and they might think that they might have to starve their baby at some point. They might have to refuse food. They might have to force feed their baby if they're not hungry. And it's really not about feeding them on a set time schedule, but just feeding them at certain points throughout the day. So the eating always will come first. That's how a baby's day will start, with eating, and after every single nap during the day they'll also eat then as well. If you already have your baby on a structured routine but you're still wondering if they're eating enough, or maybe if their crying is actually just like gastric or reflux pain, you can ask yourself a few questions to kind of help narrow down what the possible problem might be. So first you should ask, what was your baby's birth weight? If your baby was born pretty big, then they're gonna have a bigger stomach. So they're going to need to take in more food, probably a little less frequently than other babies. They'll also be able to last a little longer at night because they're taking in so much at each feed. However, if they are bigger and they're just eating a small amount, then you can assume they're doing something called snacking, which means that at each mealtime, they're just snacking. They're not actually taking in a full feed. They're just doing half a feed or just a little bit to feel satisfied. Also, if your baby's birth weight was very low, maybe they were premature, maybe they were a twin, maybe both, but probably around 6 pounds. I believe she considers anything under 6.5 pounds to be low. Then your baby's stomach is going to be smaller. and they'll probably have to eat more frequently. You probably won't be able to, in the first few weeks, have them go more than 2 hours at a time, which can be a little frustrating and totally exhausting. But if your baby is on the smaller side, you should be feeding them that frequently. You can help them gain weight faster that way so that their stomach does expand, and then they will be able to eventually take in more food. Another question you can ask yourself is, am I bottle feeding or breastfeeding? So with formula, you know how much your baby's eating. You measure out at each feed. You see what they do eat, what they don't. If they are more hungry, then you can add some more formula in. You can assume if your baby is eating an average amount of formula for their age range, that they're probably getting enough food. If they seem hungrier, you can obviously up that amount of formula and see if they'll take it, see if that makes a difference in the way that they sleep and behave. They also just might not be finishing the bottle, and so you know that they're full and that they're taking in enough because you know that there's more formula left that they're just not interested in. But with breastfeeding, things can get a little more tricky and complicated. You never really know how much breast milk you're making. You never know how much your baby's even getting. If you even see it leave and go into their mouth. The best way to measure that is to time your feeds. So I use an app on my phone whenever I am breastfeeding, and it's called Nara Baby. It's a really great app. I'm also not affiliated with them at all, but it's completely free. It has a very beautiful UI. It's very aesthetic looking, but it also has no ads, which a lot of parenting apps out there have so many ads, it's ridiculous. So Nara, N-A-R-A, if you're looking for an app. I would also use that to time my daughter's naps and to track things like giving her medicine, to track her growth, tracking her vaccines, tracking her diapers as well. And caregivers can use it too, which is really great. So when you have a babysitter, they can use it and plug in the information. So you want to have some sort of breastfeeding timer, even if you're just looking at the clock and you're just counting the minutes. You should be in the first 6 weeks looking at between 20 and 40 minutes that your child is eating total. If they're eating 15 minutes or less, then you can probably assume that they're snacking just in the first 6 weeks. That's pretty abnormal unless you have a very small baby that seriously can't take in that much. Then you should be expecting 20 to 40 minutes. And I even at sometimes in those first 6 weeks would go 45 minutes to an hour with my daughter. There was just times that it just seemed like she could never have enough. Another question you should ask yourself is, how often are you feeding your baby? You should never in the first 6 weeks be making them go longer than 3 hours between feeds. You can, if you have clearance from your pediatrician, see if they'll go longer at night. I believe by 6 weeks my daughter could go a regular 5 to 6 hours at night without eating, but throughout the day it was always 3 hours, sometimes even less, especially in the evening. I would try to cluster feed a bit to fill her up for the night. The baby whisperer calls that tanking up. So there were times that maybe she'd go 2 to 2.5 hours between feeds in the evening. And then if you are noticing that your baby's eating an hour or less between feeds at any time, then they're 100% snacking. And you also might need to check your milk supply as well if you are breastfeeding. So if you have any breastfeeding concerns at this time that have to do with your milk supply, you should just contact a lactation consultant. I'm not going to give you any advice on breastfeeding. It's so complicated and complex. The Baby Whisperer does offer some breastfeeding advice. She suggests taking a yield of your milk, but I don't think that's a very accurate way of tracking. I think most mothers know that it's not. I very often would pump and I would just I couldn't get more than 2 ounces, even though I could be completely full. I could have like 8 ounces, but I couldn't get out more than 2. Just pumps are not efficient enough, and they're not good indicators of if your milk supply is high or low. Then you can ask yourself, how long is a feed lasting? So like I mentioned, 20 to 40 minutes should be the time that it takes for you to breastfeed your baby. And then keep in mind that the A and easy is for activity, and that comes after eating. So your baby is less likely to fall asleep during a feed. If they fall asleep, you have to wake them up. Some parents might assume that their baby is falling asleep because they're full and they're done eating and they may lay them down. So if you even find that your baby is going less than an hour between feeds and it's because you're just laying them down when they fall asleep, then they're not taking in their full feed. You need to wake them up. What I would have to do in the middle of a feed is change my daughter's diaper. I wouldn't do it to wake her up, and I wouldn't do it at the end of the feed. I would do it in the middle. She would also usually poop at the beginning of the feed anyway, so it worked out really well. But it would wake her up. It would get her alert again so she could finish eating. And if she was already done eating, it would just wake her up a little bit so that I would get that confirmation that she was definitely done. And a lot of parents also might be concerned about the whole dreaded feeding to sleep. You don't want your baby to rely on breastfeeding in order to fall asleep. And so if your baby does keep falling asleep during feeds, you might be concerned about that. However, it is completely normal, especially in the first like 2 to 4 weeks, for your baby to fall asleep constantly. They're so tired. It just seems like they might always be falling asleep. So you should really only be concerned if your baby falls asleep more than 3 times in a row. And I would say more than 3 times in a row during the day, because there are just certain times during the day where they just are sleepy. You'll notice in the morning your baby is more sleepy than they are in the evening. So they're more likely to fall asleep during a feed at night or in the morning than they are in the afternoon or evening. So if you just notice that your baby always falls asleep during every single feed and it's almost near impossible to wake them up, or they just seem like they're in a really deep sleep, you should be concerned about your baby being fed to sleep. So what you really want to do is make sure that any activity that happens, even if it is just a simple diaper change that lasts like 5 minutes, try to do that after the feed. Make that their activity time. They're not going to have a very long wake window no matter what, but you want to really do that all after the feed to make sure they're completely full before you send them off to sleep. Also, you can ask yourself, do you give your baby a pacifier? Some parents, first thing in the hospital, give their baby a pacifier. Some parents are more afraid of the pacifier and they see 2-year-olds walking around with one in their mouth and they don't want that to be their child. I certainly did not want that, but you should not be afraid of the pacifier. What Tracy Hogg says is that babies need a lot of suckling time in the first 3 months that they need to have fulfilled. So you might even notice at the end of feeds that your baby is doing something called non-nutritive sucking, where they're making a sucking feeling with their mouth, but they're not getting anything out. Usually you can tell because they're pretty like loose about it and you're just like, okay, come on. At that point, that's a perfect time to give them a pacifier. I personally gave my daughter a pacifier starting at 3 weeks. I just wanted to make sure my milk supply was good before I gave her one. I think it's totally fine to give them one from the start unless there are milk supply concerns. And I just personally recommend, if you don't want your baby to have a pacifier long term, just take it away before 6 months. I took my daughters away at 4 months when we sleep trained her, and I was okay with her having one during the day, but she just was not interested. If you just take it away at any time before 6 months, that's when they really get attached to it, then you'll have no problem. They're not going to put up a fight. They probably won't even notice that it's gone, honestly. But pacifiers are so helpful, I think, especially in the first 2 months. The Baby Whisperer says the first 3, but I think when you get to 3 months, you can start to fall into the danger of using a pacifier as a sleep prop, and that's what I'll talk about more in her sleep chapter later. Definitely in the first 6 weeks, use a pacifier. It just is a way that your baby can help soothe themselves, especially if they do just want to suck on something and they're not necessarily hungry. And then the last question you can ask yourself here is, how long is your baby's activity period? You really shouldn't be making them do more than anything that's 5 to 10 minutes long. And it shouldn't be anything stimulating or overstimulating, really. It might just be staring at the ceiling fan. It could just be looking at a black and white picture. It should be very, very simple. If you have friends over, it might be them getting to hold your baby for a little bit. They could look out the window and look at the trees, move, something like that. You really don't want to push your baby too far. You're going to overstimulate them if you do, and then they will have a harder time falling asleep for their nap. Also, keep in mind that activity is exhausting. So if you're making them do too much during their activity time, they'll be hungrier because they're burning so many calories. Even just sitting up for a baby this age is exhausting. So just keep in mind simple things, really don't do a lot. Do tummy time, obviously, but nothing extreme and nothing for a long period of time. And at this point in the book, the Baby Whisperer does talk a lot about breastfeeding and tries to give some breastfeeding tips. I really just recommend you contact a lactation consultant if you have any concerns. And if you still are concerned after seeing a lactation consultant, I recommend seeing another one. I actually saw 3 lactation consultants in my daughter's first week of life, and it wasn't until the 3rd one that we actually figured out what my problem was. My daughter had a tongue tie. She was causing me so much pain. I had like cracked, bleeding nipples. Every second of breastfeeding hurt. She wasn't getting enough. She was constantly cluster feeding. And it took 3 lactation consultants to figure that out. And it's so obvious to me. And I'm just shocked that the first 2 had absolutely no idea. Really, if you think something's wrong, just go see some other people that have good recommendations. If you have any other mom friends, see who helped them out and go to them. But every lactation consultant is different. They all receive different types of training, and they all might believe different sorts of treatments or things are right for you. So really, if you have any concern, go see one. It's so worth the money. There are a few quick tips though that Tracy Hogg does talk about that I really like a lot that I just wanted to share. The first one is to only nurse on one side during each feed. And this is something you want to do after your milk supply is established. So usually by 2 weeks, that should be the case. I actually never nursed on both sides, even in those first 2 weeks. I didn't even know that was a thing. And so many people do it. I'm actually shocked. It seems exhausting to just be constantly having to switch during every single feed. I did have to nurse on both sides. I think once my daughter turned about 9 or 10 months, she just emptied both sides completely every single feed. But before that, she was just only doing one side at a time. And the reason for this is, first of all, I think it's easier to track if you're just doing one side. And no, you're not gonna be lopsided. You're not gonna feel empty on one side and full on the other. I actually did it a lot too, because my nipples were so shredded from her tongue tie that it would give them a break between feeds. So if you are having a lot of nipple sensitivity or any nipple injuries or anything like that, just doing one side at a time will just give each side more time to rest between feeds. But the reason that the Baby Whisperer says that it's a good idea is because of the milk. So there's actually 2 types of milk when you breastfeed, and it all comes out. So there's the foremilk, and that is the milk that your baby gets at the beginning of the feed. And this milk is really watery. So if you've pumped at the beginning of a feed, you might just notice it's very, very watery, very thin, almost like translucent. But if you pump at the end of a feed or after a feed, you're gonna notice it's a lot thicker and creamier, and that is your hind milk. And so your foremilk only quenches your baby's thirst. So a lot of babies who fall asleep during feeds are falling asleep after their thirst is quenched. And during this time as well, oxytocin is being released in their brain, and they're relaxing and they're feeling good. And it's usually around the time your letdown is happening as well. So they are totally satisfied by this, but only temporarily. What they really need to be fully satisfied and to have their hunger satisfied is the hind milk. And the hind milk is the thick, creamy, sweet milk that will actually satisfy their hunger and keep them full for longer. So the problem when you feed on 2 sides for each feed that you might encounter is if your baby is only getting foremilk on both sides. And I don't know how common of a problem this is. It depends on how much milk you're producing and how much milk your baby is eating. But if you only do like 10 minutes on each side for a feed, they're likely only getting foremilk. And you really want them to completely empty each breast before you switch them to the next one. If you do feed on both sides and you think you need to, because it does seem that your baby's completely emptying a breast, then that's fine. I think obviously, you know, just do whatever you prefer. But I just never saw that as the case. My daughter could just only empty one breast and she was completely full, completely satisfied by that. There's also some other myths that float around, I think, that say like your baby will get bored if they're only on like one side at a time. And I'm just like, okay, I don't think my baby's gonna get bored from looking at the same thing for an entire feed, because the next feed will be completely different because they'll be looking at something else. Some other tips: it's okay to supplement if your baby is hungry and you just wanted to exclusively breastfeed. You might need to give them formula, and a lactation consultant might suggest that to you, and it might be absolutely devastating, and I completely understand how that might feel, but your baby needs to be fed. And you can, if you give them formula, work on your milk supply and try to get it up to where you're just exclusively breastfeeding. Another quick tip: you should try to introduce a bottle around 4 weeks. Most lactation consultants do recommend 4 weeks as well, and you want to keep it regularly in their life. So the reason why you want to wait 4 weeks is because then they're used to breastfeeding, especially if you want them to be used to breastfeeding and you want them to prefer it, but also because you're going to need to pump if you're just going to feed them breast milk. If you're going to do formula, you might be able to do it a little sooner, but if you're going to pump, then you're basically sending your body signals to create more milk, and you don't want to do that before 4 weeks because your milk supply is still regulating, and you don't want to over-regulate it and send it too many signals that it needs to produce more when it doesn't. Additionally, pumping for most women, I think, is not as stimulating as an actual baby, so it could even deplete your supply if you're replacing too many feeds with pumping in the beginning. And the reason you want to keep that bottle regularly in their life is for the future. At 6 months, when they start solids, you're gonna also want to introduce a bottle. Whether this bottle is full of water, formula, or breast milk, it doesn't really matter, but they're gonna be more open to it if they've had more experience with an actual bottle before. I just went ahead and did a sippy cup. At that time, I didn't have to give her like a bottle of water or anything before that. Just did a sippy cup of water and she took it very well. So it seems like you're really looking into the future ahead, but it's really worth it. And I believe that Baby Whisperer recommends doing a bottle a day. I think that's way too much. I just hated pumping. So I would do a bottle a week, and usually she would get a bottle whenever she had a babysitter anyway, no matter what. So that happened not every week, obviously, but it happened frequently enough to where she had to get that experience of taking the bottle, and she would just refuse it sometimes outright. But my baby is a textbook baby, so she was pretty mellow with it. If you do have a more grumpy or touchy baby, then you'll want to have the bottle in their life more regularly. If you have an angel baby, then you probably don't have to worry about it as much. Additionally, the last quick tip she has is to do a dream feed as early as you can. So once you have them on the easy routine, you're going to be setting a bedtime for them. And about 2.5 hours after that bedtime, you should be doing what's called a dream feed. A dream feed should take place between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. It should never be later than 11, never earlier than 10. And I love the dream feed. Some parents say that it doesn't work for them. I think there are some babies who would just wake up. But a dream feed, when done perfectly, keeps your baby asleep for the whole feed. And then once you're done, you can just lay them back down and they're just asleep. And it's really amazing when you spend so much time putting your baby to sleep throughout the day. It's just a really quick feed. It's a full feed that can get them going a really long stretch at night. So the goal is to not have them go a long stretch starting at their bedtime to whenever, but if you do their bedtime and then you do a dream feed, say their bedtime's at 8, if you do a dream feed at like 10:30, then you put them down by 11, then obviously your next goal is to get them to go till 7, so you can get 8 hours of sleep during that time. But at 6 weeks, you're probably not going to experience that yet. I did actually experience my daughter's first 8-hour stretch when she was 6 weeks old. It was the first time I ever tried a dream feed, and it worked really well. So I, for my next baby, will be starting a dream feed literally probably from birth. So it's never too early to start the dream feed. For sure, always do it. If it's never too late either, unless your baby is older than 7 months. That is when you stop the dream feed, which seems like a while, but it's really going to be worth it. As soon as you have that dream feed as a constant, regular feed, then your baby will be more likely to sleep through the night sooner. Now looking at 6 weeks to 4 months, usually by 6 weeks, hopefully by 8, you have everything figured out with breastfeeding, you understand your baby more, you understand their cries, and you're going to start to experience some other things that are coming up. Growth spurts are usually a thing around 6 weeks is when a baby's first growth spurt might be. If they're premature, they might have some small growth spurts sooner just to get back up to birth weight, but you're really going to see those start to be a thing after 6 weeks. Additionally, around this time, most feeding problems are going to manifest themselves in poor sleep. So your problems around this time aren't necessarily, is my baby eating enough, but how can I get my baby to sleep by eating enough? So the goal by 3 months old is that your baby should definitely be eating every 3 hours. You should never make them eat more than 3 hours before they're 3 months old unless they're a giant tank and they can just consume so much at once. And then by 4 months, you're going to have them go every 4 hours. So at 4 months, it's actually not age appropriate anymore for them to be only going 3 hours at a time. They can go 4 hours at 4 months. So if your baby is not lasting that long and they should be, then here's some other questions that you can ask yourself. First, ask yourself, how many naps are they taking and for how long? Babies can actually get their days and nights mixed up if their naps are too long during the day. If they're napping for more than 2 hours at a time during the day, they're basically robbing their nighttime sleep to use it during the day. And that's probably the last thing we want at this age, when all we want is to get a nice long stretch of sleep at night. Additionally, you'll find that your baby just generally is probably more tired in the morning. So a lot of parents are more likely to have their baby take a really long morning nap, and that nap should never be more than 2 hours. And you'll find then that your baby is less awake or less sleepy in the evening. They'll be taking 45-minute naps at that time of day. If your baby is taking good naps but can't put more than 3 to 4 hours at night by 6 weeks, then you can assume that they're not eating enough during the day. So what you want to do, if you're bottle feeding, you want to up the amount of ounces in each bottle during the day, and then you want to tank up your baby at night. The same thing with breastfeeding, just add on about 5 minutes at the breast for each feed during the day. And then you tank up at night, and the way you tank up at night, and by night I mean the evening, you want their last 2 feeds of the day before bedtime to be shorter apart. So it's okay if you're doing 2 to 2.5 hours stretches during that time for your baby. You're just trying to get as much food into their body as possible so they can sleep longer. And that's just a temporary thing. So don't have that be a constant thing in their schedule. That just should help you with your supply to ramp that up, so that you can have more throughout the day to give them when they should be eating. And then another question you can ask yourself is, my baby waking up during the night at the same time, or is their behavior erratic? If it's erratic waking, then it's usually a growth spurt. So you'll want to do that same thing of giving them more calories during the day. And if they're waking up at the same hour every evening, then that's typical feeding behavior. So you want to try to up their feed intake so they don't eat at night anymore. So that's when you'll want to definitely tank up in the evening, make sure they get a full dream feed, and then really try to push those nighttime feeds to their morning wake up feed. All right, and then we get to 4 to 6 months. So this is a relatively calm period. I don't remember having any issues with the way that my daughter ate. At this time, it was a really great rhythm. We were more focused on sleep training, and eating was just smooth sailing. It was really great. That's just the case because we were doing the routine for the last month and a half or so. If you've been doing this routine for a while, then it should be relatively calm. If it's new, it might take some time to settle in. And if you're not experiencing that calmness or smooth sailing at this age, then the best thing you can do is get your baby on a routine. You'll get them on the 4-month, 4-hour routine, which will be covered in a later video as well. And if they're not going 4 hours by 4 months, then they are probably just snacking at their meal times. At this age, because 4 months is a huge change in your baby's brain, and we'll talk about that more, of course, with the sleep chapter, but they can actually, you can go cold turkey on them during the night if they are still snacking. And I mean that except for the dream feed. So you'll always keep the dream feed. You should have 4 feeds during the day that are 4 hours apart. So you should be only breastfeeding 5 times a day at this point for an entire 24-hour period. But if you're finding that your baby is constantly snacking 2 to 3 hours day and night, then the only way that the Baby Whisperer recommends to reset this is to just cut them off at night. They'll cry, they'll be hungry, you will not be starving them because they're going to eat and get onto a normal routine in the morning, and their bodies can handle this at this age. A lot of people still see their 4-month-old as a tiny baby, and they are. They're so cute and small, but they're pretty tough at this age and they can handle a lot. So you can put them down for bed, do the dream feed, try to make that as full a feed as possible, and then during the night, if they wake up, do the pick up put down maneuver, which we will talk about later, and try to get them back to sleep. And then in the morning, she'll take in a full feed, and then you just get them on that every 4 hours, and that will completely stop their snacking. That's the fastest way to do it, probably the easiest, though it might be really hard. Then looking at 6 to 9 months really briefly, you're going to be introducing solids by 6 months, and it looks different in every country. So the way Tracy Hogg talks about it, she calls it weaning starting at 6 months, and that's because